So the month of November was a pretty interesting reading month for me. I read 8 different things this month. Most of those ended up being either a short story or a novella. I read 1 graphic novel that I'm also going to talk about in here, and I read 3 full-length novels. The first novel that I finished this month was The Last Murder at the End of the World by Stuart Turton. I gave it a 3-star rating. I thought overall it was a pretty good book. This is actually one I haven't done a review for, and I'm not sure if I will. I'm not sure I have enough to say about it for me to really justify doing a review, so I'll kind of do my best to talk about it here in a little bit more depth than I normally would in a wrap-up. I saw Jimmy from the Fantasy Network talking about this book, and he compared it that there are some small elements that reminded him of Attack on Titan. He said that, and I knew I had to jump on it and give it a try. And yes, I can definitely see that there are some Attack on Titan elements mixed in with this book, and overall I thought it was a good time. I really liked the first half of this book much more than the second half. I personally found the second half it delivered on pretty much everything I wanted it to, maybe not executed the best, but I think that my biggest problem was there were so many characters, so many names, so many different points of view changing and people accusing people of different things that it was really hard for me to keep it all straight when I was reading it at the time. It almost felt like I needed to go back and reread this whole book after I just read it to really be able to follow everything and some of the familial connections and, you know, who doesn't like who thinks who did what, just a lot of things happening there at the end that I think maybe hurt my enjoyment a little bit of it. This is an author that I plan on reading something more. Jimmy and I actually talked about reading something else from this author in 2025, and I think I would like to. There was a lot of things that I did like about this, and while this wasn't like a home run or anything, it was still a good book. It's a good time. I think that if it's a murder mystery kind of setting, is something you'll like with some other elements mixed in, especially around like deception, and there's what makes somebody human. I think this is one of those books that maybe you will enjoy, and I would recommend it to you. Then the next 3 things I read were all sci-fi short stories, and the first one being The Last Question by Isaac Asimov. This is actually my first introduction to Isaac Asimov. I made a video a little while back, and somebody suggested that this may be a good place to start with him as an author, and while I think this is maybe a good introduction to him in general, I don't think it really tells me too much about him as an author because it is so short, and that's not a problem. The Last Question, and because it's so short, I won't go too much into it because I don't want to spoil anything, but basically the last question is there's a question that is being asked over and over again as technology advances, as time advances through human society, and the same question keeps getting asked over and over again, and we basically just kind of get the same answer over and over again, and we just kind of see this progression as technology and humanity grows. I thought it was an interesting concept. I can see how when this book or novella, short story, whatever you want to call it, first came out, that it was maybe a little bit more mind-blowing than it is today. But unfortunately, I really wanted this to give me maybe an idea of what I can expect from Asimov. And like I said, I'm not sure it can because it's just so short. I am glad I read it. I think it's a fine introduction into his work. And I think maybe as I read more of him and I go back to it and be like, oh, maybe there are some footprints that I can see from that in all of his writing. But without having that experience with him as an author, I can't really say. I gave it 3 stars. Like I said, it's so short. I don't know how, unless you're really blown away by the concept that's being explored here, how you can think about it being much more than like just good. And if you don't like it, you probably just don't like some of these strange sci-fi concepts. So I think in general, it's just a good thing. I recommend that you read it because it's so short. It like takes up none of your time. This is one of those things that you can probably sit down and read and like, I don't even know. It's so short, but it is a good enough time that like if it's something from Isaac Asimov that you haven't read it, you might as well because it's so short. The next story I read is The Story of Your Life. This is just a little bit longer of a short story than The Last Question was, and this is actually the short story that the movie Arrival with Amy Adams is based off of, and I didn't know that going into it at the time. I'm kind of glad I didn't because I just kind of got to get that realization pretty early on. It's pretty obvious. It's not like a surprise, but I did like that. Overall, I don't know if I like the movie or this more. They're so similar yet so different in a couple different ways. So they're like just such different experiences. It's hard to compare them. I think one interesting thing here is because it's such a short story, it's harder to compare than like when you get an adaptation of a novel, you have everything in the novel. And obviously with this being a short story, there's not enough for what I think it's a 2-hour-long movie that they end up doing. So there's a lot of stuff that, it makes it harder to compare, which I found to be quite interesting. But The Story of Your Life in general was a good time. I'm glad I read it. It was very beautifully written, and some of the stuff that comes out of the movie is pulled straight from the short story. And some of those elements are the things that I like the best about the movie. So this is another one. I think you can find this one for free online. I think there's just like a PDF that if you Google it, it's like available, not pirated or anything. And I would recommend it too. I think it's a really good time. I think I gave this one a 3-star as well. Once again, it's kind of me with short stories. It's one of those things where if it's good, it's good. Not oftentimes do I feel like a short story really gets much higher than that, and I've had that happen plenty of times. But once again, another thumbs up for The Story of Your Life. And then the last short story that I read in the sci-fi genre this month was Live Suits. Now this is book 1.5 in the Captive War series, and this is by James S.A. Corey. The Captive War series is the one that Mercy of the Gods came out this year for, and this is pretty a similar thing that they did with The Expanse, that is James S.A. Corey did with The Expanse, is they would have a main novel come out, and then they would have a supplementary short story novella kind of come in and be a 1.5 to before book 2 came out, just kind of give you some different information of what the going on of the universe are. And I will say, going from the Mercy of the Gods to this felt so different, just because the setting and the situation that is happening is just crazy. Now I will say, I think this is a really interesting short story for what it makes me think the rest of that series is going to be. I think what we saw in The Mercy of the Gods is going to be so different than what we see in book 2. And honestly, from reading this, I think book 2 is going to be something that I'm going to enjoy even more than I enjoyed in book 1. And I know for some people, book 1 wasn't what they were expecting. I think a lot of people were expecting The Expanse. And I'll say it again and again, The Mercy of the Gods is not The Expanse. Do not come into it wanting more of The Expanse, because you're not getting it. It's a very different story. The characters are very different. The situation is so different. They're going for something that I feel is very and just completely different than The Expanse, which is good. I would love more of The Expanse, but if it's going to be The Expanse, I want it in The Expanse world. I don't want something new that's just watered down Expanse. But with all that being said, this is another good one. If you're going to read The Mercy of the Gods, you should probably read this. If you are reading The Expanse right now and you're not reading the novellas, you should definitely go back and read the novellas. There are some really, to me, important novellas, especially later on in the series for The Expanse. So quick aside there for that. But once again, Live Suits, it's a good time. If you're going to read Mercy of the Gods, definitely read this afterwards. It will, I think, paint a picture of what the rest of that series is going to look like. And now back to a full-length novel, finally. Like I said, a strange month for me reading-wise, but then this novel is The Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne. This was a highly, highly anticipated book for me. I really enjoyed The Hunger of the Gods, which is the second book in the Bloodsworn trilogy by John Gwynne. And I don't want to say unfortunately, because I still thought The Fury of the Gods was a really good book. It just wasn't as good as The Hunger of the Gods for me. And honestly, maybe even The Shadow of the Gods, it's really close. Like, the good books, and I never want, when I say that something is a 3-star in a book, and I know for some people that means it's not a good book. For me, that's a really good book. It's solid. I had a good time with it. I highly recommend this trilogy still. I think this is a great place if you want to get somebody into fantasy. This is a great trilogy to give them. I think the scope of this series is just different than a lot of other fantasies, or maybe even what I really was expecting and wanting from this. I would have rather this maybe have been drawn out for a whole nother book or something, personally. But I think this is one of those books where, just because not every single element of it worked super well or perfectly for me, that there are a lot of people that it will work for. And I think that more importantly, I think this book achieves the goals it's going after, which, like I said, I think that is more important than me necessarily liking it. I think if a book, and I can respect it so much more if I think it does exactly what it wants to do, the way it wants to do. And I think this book is a perfect example of that while my own personal rating is very obviously subjective to me, I think there are some of those more objective things that I can look at in a book and be like, hey, while yes, I didn't like certain elements, I felt certain things were rushed, all of these little things, I think it's what that book wanted to do. And that's an interesting thing to talk about, because, it's good. It's just not like a new favorite or anything like that, new super high up there favorite or anything. This is still, once again, I feel like I have to say it so many times that it's a good book, because I don't want people to hear 3-star and think it's not good when it is good. But there are definitely some things in here that I highly respect it, because it did what I felt like it wanted to do, which is always a really interesting thing to see. And this is one of those books that make me question giving ratings out the way that I do, just because I feel like people get really hung up on ratings sometimes, when for me they're almost a throwaway, not completely, especially when it comes to star ratings. It's definitely more of a throwaway. I have my own personal list where I rank stuff that I take much more seriously, and maybe I'll share that at some point. But overall, I have a review out for this book. It's a good time. If you haven't read it, you should. If you've read the first 2, you definitely should. This isn't gonna, like, it's not a letdown in any way. It's just not necessarily my favorite of the trilogy, and it's pretty good, all around. Then next up, we have a graphic novel. And normally I don't read too many graphic novels. I think this is the second one I've read this year, and this one is Beneath the Tree Where Nobody Sees. And this is, if you are familiar with the show Dexter, where there is a serial killer doing things, this graphic novel is very, very similar, but in different ways. And it's pretty short, so I won't talk too much about it. Just some things that I will mention is I think our main character is handled super well. I think there are a lot of authors and stories that would have taken this main character and done something, particularly at the end of this story, and done something completely different with them, and it would have annoyed me and made me not enjoy it. And because the route that this character took, because of who that character is, I think it's just masterfully done, right? It's great. And I will also just say the artwork in the series is just great. I really enjoyed it. I'm not sure why I don't read more graphic novels and stuff, but because I read manga and I used to read comics quite a bit. But as far as graphic novels go, this is a great one. It's one that I would definitely recommend that a lot of people check out because it's fun, it's quick, and I think it's just handled really well. So this is one that I ended up giving a 4-star rating to. I will say my graphic novel, like manga ratings, are not nearly as strict or as refined as my book ones. So take that with a grain of salt, maybe. It was really good. I really did have a good time with it. You should read it. I got it from my library, so check your library out. They might have it. But this is another one that I think a lot of people will like. I'm glad I read it. It was a nice little break from my regular reading. Now on to my third and final full-length novel that I read in the month of November. I finally got around to reading a little bit more of Stephen King. King has been a revelation for me this year. I have really enjoyed reading him. I read It before this year, took like a whole year or two break from reading him, and then this year have just really fallen in love with him as an author. And The Shining is really seen as kind of his magnum opus for a lot of people. And for me, I really liked it. I gave it a 4-star rating, but this is nowhere near my favorite Stephen King book. And I don't know how much of that is because I knew so much of what was going to happen because I've seen the movie so many times and I really like the movie. Do I like the movie more than the book now? I'd have to rewatch the movie probably to see. To me, they are so vastly different though that it's really hard to complain. They're both doing things and achieving things that are completely different. And so I can totally see why Stephen King did not like that adaptation specifically when it came out from Kubrick and everything. But there's just it's just so different. And so it's hard for me to compare. And it's really hard for me to have really strong feelings about the book, just because I felt like all of my feelings were just kind of being intertwined with the movie. So, and this is something that I haven't always had a problem with. Some books I have gone in, like Jurassic Park, for example. I love the movie. I thought the book was good. I didn't really feel like a connection between the two in the same way that I do with the versions of The Shining. And so it's interesting. Like I said, it's still really good. It's still really good King. It's just a really good book. If you haven't read it, you probably should. But yeah, I just have some really like strange feelings overall, and I think it stems from the movie and just how I feel about the movie more than I feel about the book. I will say, speaking just strictly from the book, it never felt like it got to that level of some of the other King books that I have read. Specifically, I'm thinking of like Pet Sematary. For me, that is my favorite King book. It's one of my favorite books I've ever read, and I just never got as connected to the things happening here in The Shining as I did for something like that, or even Misery, or even Cujo. I think there were just some things that I felt like I was much more connected than with The Shining. And I don't know if that's because, and it's not that the Pet Sematary isn't really horror, but maybe just kind of some of the horror elements. It's not, I don't know exactly. And I feel like I sound negative, but this is still one of the better books I've read this year. It's probably top 15 of the year. So with all of that negativity, still a really good book, and I'm glad I read it. It's one I actually had been putting off, even though I had wanted to read it, just because I was worried with the movie being something that I don't know, maybe that one's just in my brain so much, but glad I read it. It was a good experience overall, and it's another one that I can check off on my slow march towards the Dark Tower at some point. And then my last short story novella that I am actually still currently reading, filming this a little bit before the end of November, but I am pretty sure I will go ahead and finish it, is in this month, is The Mountain Crown by Karen Laushi. I'm not 100% sure how to say her last name, but I actually saw John over at Talking Story mentioned this book, that Janny Wirtz mentioned this book to him. It sounded interesting. It's a very short book. It gives me time, or it's just like the perfect time filler between now and December 1st when the new Bachman short story that I'm going to read comes in. So I decided to go ahead and read it, and I'm not very far into it, but like I said, it's short, so I'll definitely finish it. But so far, I like it. The writing seems nice. The story deals with, it seems like, I don't know if I specifically can call it colonization yet, but it seems like there was a war and a group of people was pushed out, and now that the war is over, there's people coming back to their homeland after they had been pushed out, and there's some stuff going on there. But so far, so good. Seems like I'm on the right track of really enjoying it. So we'll go ahead and see what ends up happening there. So unless the Mountain Crown ends up being an absolute revelation to me, I'm gonna go ahead and confidently say that my book of the month is going to end up being The Shining. Like I said, anything can happen. The Mountain Crown could take that. I don't think that's going to happen, but if it does, that would be great. But right now we're going to have The Shining as my book of the month with that solid 4-star rating. Okay, now let's quickly change over to any of the manga I have read, and maybe I should have talked about the graphic novel I read earlier here instead of in the novels. But on the manga front, 3 chapters of Black Clover kind of dropped out of nowhere for me, so I went ahead and read that, and I will say I am really ready for Black Clover to be over. I feel like it's a series that has been drawn out for way too long. It's not one that I've been overly invested in. It's kind of your classic shonen champion kind of thing. I feel like the plot points have kind of shifted throughout the series, kind of went in directions that like I didn't really need. And I will say I really liked Fairy Tail whenever I watched that anime, 8 years ago or whatever. But Black Clover has felt more and more like Fairy Tail than I ever expected it to. And it's honestly like a worse version for me, where I don't care about as some of the other characters nearly as much as I did in Fairy Tail. So it's kind of going for the Fairy Tail effect, and it's just not hitting the same way. I think that's maybe part of the reason why I want it to be over. But I guess I'm ready for it. I'm excited to at least see what happens. We're getting super, super close with Asta and everybody. So we'll see what ends up happening there. And then I also read like a chapter of the newest chapter of Boruto. Maybe there are 2. I was 2 behind. Whatever it is, I'm caught up now. And this is kind of how I always feel about Boruto. Boruto is Boruto. It's doing its own thing. I don't think it's the best planned out story. I think there's some really weird plot things going on. I feel like it's really just a continuation because we needed more Naruto, and they didn't want to let that IP rest. And if they had taken time, I have a whole rant that I could go on with Boruto, because there's some stuff in there that is super, super good, super well done. And then the other stuff that just really makes me scratch my head and wonder what's going on over there, and what is the point of any of this. So that is the 2 pieces of manga I have read recently. Switching over to anything that I have watched, the only thing I have been watching recently is a few episodes of Reba. Yes, the Reba show from like the early 2000s. I have slowly been rewatching that. I'm still like I'm almost at the end of season 1, I think. So I haven't been watching a whole lot of it, but it is fun to go back and see TV capturing that particular time, that particular idea. Just, I don't know. It's just interesting to go back and see, especially something that I watched kind of growing up, but not really, just kind of catching episodes here and there to kind of watch it through and see some of the things that are going on. It's pretty funny. I do catch myself laughing at some of the just craziness that is that show. And then the only other thing that I really ever watch is NFL football. I had an absolute meltdown last week when the Steelers lost to the Browns in that snow game. If you know what I'm talking about, that game just classic Tomlin game, always loses that one. I mean, I knew before that game even started that was a game that we absolutely were going to lose. Tomlin is now like 0-7 on Thursday nights on the road against division rivals, all time or something like that. Or he's 6-0 and the Steelers all time, or 8-0, 0-8, 0-7. We don't win, we lose. But that's okay. We've got a big game this week to bounce back against the Bengals. The Bengals normally torch us. We like to play single high, and Joe Burrow is just a monster against single high man coverage. He's just going to tear us up if that's what we decide to do. I have questions about Terrell Austin and his ability as a defensive coordinator, always has. I feel like he's somebody who's been carried by the immense talent on our defense, but I'm going to go ahead and stop talking about that now because nobody wants to hear me rant about the NFL, because I'll just keep on going. But the last segment we will do here is the author spotlight, and I had an author reach out to me. Their name is Barbara Avon, and their book is called Sacrilege. And a quick little note about it is the monster isn't beneath the bed. It's in the mirror swallowing all the vile things it wants to say, choking on bile to make them go away. I'll have some links down to that below if you want to check it out. Like I said, if you're an author, you can always feel free to reach out to me with my email in the description of this video. I'm more than happy to give you a shout out. I probably will not read your book, just being honest. I have a huge TBR. I'm never say never, anything is possible, but I'm always more than happy to, try to give a little bit of support out to any author, self-published, published, whatever. I'm absolutely open to do that. But that is my month of November. Please let me know what you read, watched, all of those fun things down below in the comments. But that's all for me, and as always, have a good one.